Thank you. Evening, everybody. Good to see you, and glad and grateful that you've all stayed to the end, to the eighth and final session. It has flown by, at least it seems that way to me. But here we are with the last look in this series, looking at Amos and asking the question, is there a future? We mentioned Alison Pataki before, a novelist, and she provides a very brief historical overview to her novel on Sisi, Empress on Her Own. She begins by pointing out that Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary, otherwise known as Sisi, has changed her empire forever. In an era of crumbling dynastic monarchies, Sisi brokers a compromise between Austria and a very dissatisfied Hungary, wanting more autonomy. The Hungarians opted to remain in the kingdom and, in Pataki's words, allowed the Habsburgs to retain dominion over much of Europe without firing a shot. For Sisi herself, life in the Habsburg court is full of perils and demands. And this may be the reason, she doesn't seem to enjoy it, but this may be the reason why she spends a lot of time traveling away from Vienna, including spending time at Summerhill House in Meath in the winter of 1879. The court is a cutthroat place. And Pataki asks, is Sisi doomed to fall as the latest sacrifice made at the altar of the world's most powerful empire? Sisi was tragically assassinated in Geneva by an Italian anarchist on the 10th of September 1898. The Habsburg Empire lasted only a little longer. It was already crumbling when Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, his heir Archduke Franz Ferdinand having been assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, which of course led to the catastrophic World War I. The new Emperor Karl tried to restructure the empire on national lines after the war, but Prague, Zagreb, and Transylvania all seized power for themselves. Hungary saw a revolution which brought to power a left-wing leader, Michael Karolyi. And on the 11th of November 1918, Emperor Karl did not abdicate, but formally relinquished involvement in public affairs. Later in the day, the Austrian socialist leader Karl Renner called on Emperor Karl at the Schönbrunn Palace, bid him farewell with the now famous words, Herr Habsburg, the taxi is waiting. The next day, Austria was declared a republic. And one of the world's longest lasting and most powerful empires had disintegrated completely. As historian Martin Raddy put it, its lands being divided up into 6 states, and its ruin was the greatest. The end was final and entire. In the history of most European states, the year 1918, he says, marks the end of a chapter. 1917 in the case of Russia. For the Habsburg Empire, it is the end of the book. The Habsburg Empire was not the only empire to collapse after that catastrophic war of 1914-1918. 6 empires had gone to war, 4 coming to an end, and the war marking the beginning of the end for the French and British empires, both of which by the 1950s had also joined the wreckage of history. Now, however much empires believe they are by divine appointment, the chapter, even the book, comes to an end. No system or structure of power is guaranteed to last, and none does. And that was really the disturbing message of the prophet Amos. The northern kingdom of Israel may have believed itself chosen, liberated by Yahweh from Egyptian slavery and oppression, developed through Solomon a sense, even a theology of exceptionalism. But there was no inviolability. For Amos, God would bring it all to an end. the opulence and the rich lifestyle of the minority enjoying life in plush palace fortresses. Why were they so security conscious? Even the neighboring non-Yahwistic peoples agreed all of this was full of oppression and violence. As one commentator put it, therefore the destruction of the nation, its temples and palace fortresses was certain. Which brings us to a theme: God will not be domesticated. There is so much judgment, even final judgment in Amos, that any doxology takes us by surprise. Yet Amos has three doxologies, which may not belong to the 8th century BCE when Amos was active. The book of Amos, you may remember, was still being edited and added to during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. The doxologies may be later, not inserted by some editorial committee to soften the relentless message of judgment, but to imaginatively see the world from God's perspective, which is what worship, doxology, and liturgy does or is supposed to do, and to make a strong theological point about God, the world, and justice. Amos, in the original context, is aware of the liturgical ritual and practice going on at the shrine of Bethel. He was not opposed to the high-octane liturgy and worship in itself, but he had more than a broadside for worship without social ethics. For Amos, the practice of worship and the practice of social ethics in society was one. Social ethics, social responsibility, social engagement, and the praxis of justice was, in this case, the missing dimension of worship. They came out of their palace fortresses to celebrate worship, but forgot the God of worship was the God of justice. The elaborate worship and liturgy had narcoticized them in relation to the oppression and violence of the society that they had created. The three doxologies reflect the language of hymns in the Psalms, the prayer book or hymn book of the Jerusalem temple. And those doxologies are worth reading for a moment. The first is in Amos 4 and verse 13. For lo, he
Hello, Maura. I can see everything, but I can hardly hear
his thought. Who makes the morning darkness and treads on the heights of the earth? The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. The second doxology in Amos is in chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. He who made Pleiades and Orion, who turns deep darkness into the morning and darkens the day into night, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out upon the surface of the earth, the Lord is his name, who makes destruction flash forth against the strong, so that destruction comes upon the fortress. And the third doxology is in chapter 9 and verses 5 and 6. The Lord, the God of hosts, he who touches the earth and it melts, and all who dwell in it mourn, and all of it rises like the Nile and sinks again like the Nile of Egypt, who builds his upper chambers in the heavens and finds his vault upon the earth, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out upon the surface of the earth. The Lord is his name. Now, I suppose we could note and should note that all three doxologies from Amos are full of nature images. At last, he's moved away from, if you like, historical reference and historical events, and he's moved into a world of nature and a world of nature metaphors and nature images. And that there is something here that we can pick up and look at in terms of what Amos might have to say about environmental issues with his use of this language. But there's more in the language, because the doxologies are really a celebration of God's sovereignty as creator. The Amos tradition is rooted in Israel's liturgy. The overarching theme or horizon of the book of Amos is that of God as sovereign. Now, given the centrality of judgment, it is easy to interpret sovereignty in terms of imperial power. God is almighty, exercising power in the world as omnipotence and irresistible power. Well, that is how Habsburg emperors and every monarch at the head of an empire and every imperial establishment has understood power and God and themselves appointed or anointed by God. Exceptionalism embodies this, not least in its military expression. Sovereignty is absolute power, domination and rule, and God is a warrior God created in the imperial image. Not so with Amos. The sovereign creator of the Amos tradition liturgy is, especially in chapter 9, verses 11 to 15, in Brueggemann's words, the one who will not be domesticated by any particular policy, ideology, or intellectual presupposition. God will not be domesticated by our politics, culture, economic systems, or religious establishments. God will not be put in a box. There is no for God and empire, no for God and Ireland, or for God and Ulster. God is not our ideological possession. God will not be the God of an exceptional people, any people who think themselves exceptional. Nor will God be the prisoner of our theological systems or confessional creeds. God will not be domesticated by our intellectual presuppositions. And God will not be domesticated by our pietistic forms of worship. Every attempt at the instrumentalization of God is a domestication of God, the making of an idol in our own image. The first word from Sinai was no other gods. And Amos and the Deuteronomic tradition knew that the other gods and every domestication of God was in fact a proposal for the organization of society, very often along the lines of oppression and violence. I'm going to stop there, and Loretto will move us into our rooms, and there is a question that you will see on the chat box. God will not be domesticated by any particular policy, ideology, or intellectual presupposition. Why do humans therefore construct God so often in their own image? See where we get with that conversation for the next 15 minutes. Loretto.
Yeah.
Tell you what we'll do. I want to go on and look at Amos, but I thought since we've had reference to the Quran, let me read the opening verses of the Quran, which are all important to Muslim people, because this is a prayer that Muslims will say up to at least 5 times a day, and it's not in Arabic. It's in English here, but you can hear the language. In the name of God, the all merciful, the all compassionate, all praise and gratitude, in whatever way from the first day of creation until eternity are for God, the Lord of the worlds, the all merciful, the all compassionate, the master of the day of judgment. You alone do we worship, and from you alone do we seek help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, not of those who have incurred your wrath, nor of those who are astray. That's the opening of the Quran, and is a prayer that Muslims pray daily. It's the Muslim, if you like, I think it's the Muslim equivalent in a way of what the Lord's Prayer is to Christians. So let's worship the God of justice is where we try to move now. And the 3 doxologies of Amos, as we noted, celebrated the sovereignty of the Creator God. They portray a God who will not be domesticated in any way. And not only do we have perhaps the perennial temptation to domesticate God by our political, our imperial, our cultural, and our religious ideologies, but much of our theism and our atheism is an exercise in domestication. And so too is our classism and our sexism, racism, supremacism, homophobia, sectarianism, and all the other walls we put up between ourselves and groups and others. The sovereign creator God of Amos's doxologies does not do walls or indulge in othering. And in the opening chapters, where Amos works through a litany of crimes against humanity, lining out the neighboring kingdoms along with Israel and Judah, there is no, and he's very clear about this, no exceptionalism. There is an equality of judgment, but more to the point, the nations are all creatures and are treated as such, each with the equality of moral capacity to live moral lives. No hierarchy of perpetrators or victims, no moral hierarchy, a race, a nation, a gender, a cut above the others. There is no God on anybody's side, but a God, a creator of all, and with universal concern, especially justice for all. So these doxologies are songs of worship to a sovereign creator God who will not be domesticated or tamed by any, a God of all peoples and of universal concern. God is the creator and bold and responsible for cosmic order. It is the language of poetry, metaphor, the only language that worship and theology have. Worship is a language of imagination. We imagine the sacred and imagine and reimagine the world from God's perspective. Try to literalize the language of liturgy and the language of worship, and we domesticate God and dumb down worship, something perhaps that we do often, so often, maybe it has become a habit. But the doxologies of Amos praise the God of justice. And when they came out of their palace fortresses on the festival days and shared the colorful and dynamic worship at the Bethel Shrine or the Jerusalem Temple, they tended to forget the God they worshipped. And the Amos tradition reminds all of us that these verses, these doxologies, praise the God of justice and power, who has revealed God's will to humans. The God of justice is a God to be worshipped. And so to worship the God of justice is to live justly, to build justice into the policies and structures of society, to ensure justice for all and embrace all humans and the earth as kin. The God of justice is both within and beyond us, transforming our imaginations and our living for justice. That brings us to the last theme for the evening. Is there hope? Now, there's so much judgment in Amos because his imaginative vision of God is so centered on universal justice that oppression, violence, and injustice are morally judged and they're called out. And the moral judgment is so pervasive that it is difficult to find perhaps any word of hope. So is there hope in Amos? And glimmer of a vision of the future? Well, there's not much, but there are hints, and they are daring in their expression. The Hebrew prophets were people who critiqued their societies, especially those in places of power and wealth. And the prophetic word is one of judgment expressed directly as God's judgment, which seems to suggest cannot be averted. For Amos, God will bring the northern kingdom to an end, chosen or not. But Amos and others are not without hope. The prophets dared to speak of God's future in dramatic and hopeful images. It was they who brought hope for a different future to Hebrew faith for the first time. Hosea introduces the possibility of restored relationships in solidarity. Isaiah of Jerusalem envisions a new kingdom, a new leadership, bringing about justice and right relations rooted in justice. Jeremiah has a broken covenant replaced by a renewed covenant, renewing the vision of a more just and compassionate society. And however stern and challenging the prophetic rhetoric of judgment, hope did emerge in their reading of the signs of their times. Amos has a glimmer of hope, realistic, if nothing else. And it is Amos 5, verse 15. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. There is no averting judgment. It will happen. But it might be that a remnant will survive. A few will come through the judgment carrying the possibility of a new beginning and the potential to rebuild. And the definition of what is good is narrowed down. It is to establish justice in the gate. There needs to be, and this is what Amos is initially talking about, there needs to be a just legal system. Not one that advantages the wealthy and powerful, but treats all as equal before the law, justice for those who cannot buy it or afford it. Justice in the gate also means a just economic system and a just political system. And the systems cannot be in separate boxes as though unrelated to each other. Justice is holistic. Do Black lives matter? Or do white lives matter more when it comes to wealth and power and legal justice? Now, to hate and to love in Hebrew do not refer to feelings, but to decisions. To love can mean to choose, and to hate, to reject. The verbs are imperatives, calling for action, concrete action. For Amos, it has been put this way, change is possible, and a different pattern to community can be meaningfully called for. A future is possible, but not without turning in a completely different direction, taking action to establish justice at the heart of society. And the prophets and Jesus in this prophetic tradition called this repentance, turning away from the injustices and establishing justice at every level of society. There is nothing pietistic or religious about repentance. It may be for Amos that God will be gracious. And only here is the Hebrew word hanan found, a word which means compassion. And somehow prophetic imagination can hold together justice and compassion. We may have difficulty with that. But Hebrew prophets and Jesus could celebrate God's freedom to be gracious and with God's demand for justice. Amos dared to think, or was it to imagine, a God free to change for reasons we humans cannot fathom. Judgment, however real in history, is not the end, is not the last word. There is always a potential future, a new dynamic in history. And there is human agency as we hate evil and love good and establish justice. Well, let's go to the rooms again. Couple of questions this time, wherever we end up. But to do good is to establish justice. What does that mean for living authentically today? And then there is a question which I hope is a teasing one. Is there an alternative future for the island of Ireland? Is there an alternative future for both of these islands? And who builds the future?